Hello, everybody. I'm Jackson Meisner,
And I'm Mohammed Kazarunian.
and this is the second episode of our podcast, A Winter of Discontent. The theme for this episode is going to be libertarian populism. And before we jump into that, I just want to do a quick little internal housekeeping. Um, just first off, thank you to all of those who listened to our first episode. We really appreciate it. For those who didn't catch the first episode and want to know a bit about who we are or maybe some of our credentials, we won't go over it in this episode because we don't want to belabor the point, but we are going to include a description of who we are in the description of this episode, and also we included it in our first episode. So if you have any questions there, you can go check that out. A lot of you liked the presentation of the content and said that you found it informative. So thank you so much. We really, really appreciate your feedback. We want to try to integrate it more into the podcast going forward to give you guys more of what you want to hear from us. I want to include a quick disclaimer. We do not use AI for research, for script writing, or for anything. We really believe in being transparent about that, especially because there's a lot of AI stuff proliferating around right now, and we want you to know that you're getting purely human research and purely human recording with all the errors and foibles that might come with it. All sources for this episode that we mention are going to be linked in the description, so if you want to fact check us on anything, feel free to do that. And without further ado, we can actually begin the episode.
Right. Well, as Jackson mentioned, today we'll be talking about libertarian populism, or specifically libertarian conservative populism. We'll especially be focusing on the Tea Party as the first iteration of modern right-wing populism and how that movement expanded to become a major force in American politics and then eventually became subsumed into the MAGA movement. We will be talking about general libertarian conservative beliefs, their view of American history, some specific libertarian populist beliefs as well. And then we will start talking about the rise of libertarian conservative populism on the American conservative right after the 2008 recession, and then talk about how that led to the rise of the Tea Party. We will then discuss the Tea Party's popularity, their influence, their power, and eventual fall. And lastly, we will have a discussion about why Tea Party, libertarian populism, and limited government conservatism lost out to MAGA and their new nationalist, nativist conservatism, the continued relevance of the Tea Party and its libertarian limited government ideology to the Republican Party, and finally end with an analysis of the importance of the modern libertarian populist movement. Now, a lot of you are probably asking, why are we talking about libertarian conservative populism? Why are we talking about the Tea Party? I mean, unless you're a millennial or older, you probably don't even remember that, right? I mean, Jackson and I don't really remember that. We're Gen Z.
Yeah, not really.
Exactly. But we will argue that it is actually very important to understand the Tea Party and libertarian populism from the early 2010s, because first and foremost, it is the first iteration of modern post-2008 right-wing populism and really populism in general, right? This actually starts a bit before the Occupy Wall Street movement and is much more influential, we will argue. The Tea Party is also similar to and a precursor to the MAGA movement, we will argue, and libertarian elements can be found in other right-wing populist factions. Lastly, it's important to understand the Tea Party because they play a large role in recent U.S. political history, including budget standoffs, their role in government shutdowns, debt ceiling crises, election victories, etc. And by understanding those events, we can see how the GOP went from the party of Reagan to the party of Trump.
Yeah, I think that's a great introductory statement. But before we get on to sort of the meat of the episode, I think it's good to establish a bit of background on what libertarianism actually is, or more specifically, what the right-wing version of libertarianism is. A lot of people don't really know much about libertarians beside the fact that there is a Libertarian Party, though we will actually not be discussing them this episode. Generally speaking, libertarians see themselves as sort of a continuation of the classical liberal political tradition within the United States. Now, whether they are a continuation of that tradition is a bit of a different discussion. But for just some basic scene setting, classical liberalism was a ideology that was very popular in the 18th and 19th century, kind of a response to a lot of the divine right of kings arguments that were around at that time. And it held that individuals and their rights should be protected from arbitrary government interference. It's a very sort of like Enlightenment philosophy. It was really, you could say, the Enlightenment political philosophy. Unlike libertarians, classical liberals aren't opposed to all government actions per se, like some of them supported tariffs and things like that. But they generally tend to align with the individual and their rights over the collective and its needs. Libertarianism sees itself as a continuation of that, but it very much is a 20th century phenomenon as opposed to the sort of 19th and 18th century nature of classical liberalism. And libertarianism, at least in America, is very much focused as a reaction to the New Deal, to the Great Society, which really, really expanded the power of the federal government. And they take their opposition to government action a step farther than classical liberalism, or maybe a few steps farther. They're opposed to almost all government action per se, not quite to the level of like outright anarchism, but definitely to a much greater extent than the classical liberals or the founding fathers ever were. And so essentially, you do see the libertarian movement as a more kind of radical version of classical liberalism dedicated to rolling back many of the changes in America that have happened since the sort of mid 20th century and the like ensuing social and government reforms that took place then.
Right. And I think to add on to Jackson's point there, we also want to differentiate between libertarianism, full stop, and libertarian conservatism. Libertarianism as an ideology is both very socially liberal and fiscally conservative, right? They're in favor of less government involvement in all aspects of life, in the home and private life, so like the social side, and also in the economy, so that's the fiscal conservative side. Libertarian conservatives, however, are more socially conservative and more, or at the very least, more socially moderate, and they're fine with more government intervention in private life, but they maintain the fact that the government should not intervene in the economy either. So they're still on board with that part. And these libertarian conservatives are a major wing of the Republican Party. This is the party that is protecting, limited government from that all the way back at that classical liberal founding. So we should remember that libertarian conservatives, these socially conservative but very anti-government intervention in the economy sort of people, are a major part of the economy. And these people are different from just plain libertarians per se.
Yeah, definitely. So, one thing to mention about libertarians is we said that they're a very like US centered ideology. There are libertarians, right-wing libertarians outside of the United States, but the ideology in general is very closely tied to US history. Particularly US libertarians tend to see the Constitution itself and sort of the US as the archetypical libertarian country. They would say that the country was essentially founded as an experiment in liberty, experiment to give people more liberty than they ever had before, and that the country succeeded in part because it didn't rely on too much government, it didn't rely on statist solutions, and they said that was what made the country great. But what libertarians say made the country start to go wrong is they said eventually Americans started to rely too much on government. And so there's sort of a narrative over time of kind of a losing battle against big government and sort of liberty losing out over time. And this goes across multiple different historical events. They say this starts during the Civil War because the government has to take up more power to fight the Confederacy. They say that the progressive movement in the early 20th century gives too much power to a sort of new federal bureaucracy or a newly sort of empowered central government. The New Deal, they really, really dislike because they say that's the creation of a welfare state and it's encouraging people to be dependent on government aid instead of being dependent on their own hard work. But it's really the Cold War and the Great Society that really, really upsets libertarian conservatism. And I think, Mohammed, do you want to talk a little bit about why they're so mad at the Great Society in particular, as opposed to all those other things?
Right. The Great Society kind of marks like the final like shift away from that classical liberal or almost libertarian conservative conception of America as this limited government state towards one where the government finally does take a decisive role in public life, and one that's going to provide medical services and welfare for the poor and massive environmental regulation, etc. And this, along with the 60s like culture sort of war that begins at that time between progressives and conservatives, really sets off libertarian conservative people. So they decide that once and for all, the Great Society and the New Deal as well need to be overturned. And they push for candidates like Barry Goldwater and eventually Ronald Reagan, who promised to roll back these programs. This is coming as part of a wider sort of worldwide, like neoliberal wave, many people will call it, that this push towards cutting government spending, cutting taxes, shrinking the role of government, deregulation, free trade, etc. And Reagan is the first guy who finally does start pushing down this route. And through the 90s and 2000s, Republicans are somewhat in the ascendant. Sometimes this period is called the neoliberal era, where both Democrats and Republicans sort of focus on shrinking or trimming the government down. Even Bill Clinton, a Democrat, is pushing for his third way agenda, which is more fiscally conservative. However, this push is only partially successful. Free market libertarian conservatives are frustrated because they think Republicans don't push hard enough to shrink government, and Republicans even aid and abet increasing the size of the government. Medicare Part D is passed under Bush. Patriot Act is passed under Bush. So a Republican president, Ross Perot, was supposed to be a guy that was going to shrink the size of government and cut government spending. He was not able to get elected. So they're upset by this. And I think maybe, Jackson, you can finally holistically explain what this narrative is that the libertarian conservatives have made.
Yeah, the short, maybe more concise summary of this narrative is essentially the belief that America was good because it had liberty. And all the good things in America came from the fact that Americans were able to do stuff without government interference and sort of through their own labor and their own hard work. But the reason America seems like it's declining is because liberty is being snuffed out by big government, which is causing all these economic, social, and political problems. We're fighting foreign wars because the government is in the pocket of big business who's buying influence so that they can unfairly outcompete everybody else. People are getting lazy and addicted to welfare. Federal bureaucrats are just stealing tax money from people. Congress is out of touch and just voting to give itself and the government more and more money. There are failed social policies. They're just government social engineering. And that really is just a straying from the founder's vision of a small country or the really Jeffersonian vision of a small country of independent farmers or business owners that, collaborate more voluntarily in the government social structure and are united by their shared love of liberty. That's what they think has been lost in the current America.
Yeah, and I think to briefly touch on that point, I think this explains why free market, limited government people in America are called conservative, because the founding of America is really classical liberal, limited government, pro-liberty, anti-state. And if you're conserving this vision, right, you're a conservative, right? And that's why conservatism in America has meant this like quasi-libertarian sort of ideology. But I think maybe now we can get maybe a little more into the weeds and actually look, okay, what do libertarian conservative beliefs mean in practice, especially on specific policies? And I think here we can start off with the Second Amendment and gun rights. This is a very important one for libertarian conservatives. The Second Amendment, in their view, guarantees a fundamental right, to defend yourself, to, bear arms so that you have a check on government power, the citizenry are armed, right? Another important one is the belief that the growth of government means you have fewer rights. The government has more control over society, which necessarily means the society or the individuals that make up the society have less autonomy.
Well, Mohammed, what are you going to do when the government takes you into FEMA camps and they turn you into human cattle? I mean, you're going to need the guns then. That's what the founders wanted.
Mm-hmm. Just as the founding fathers intended. Exactly. Mm-hmm. Right. I don't know, maybe Jackson, you could talk maybe more about government programs or the bureaucrats that work for the government then.
Yeah, well, let's just say libertarians have a whole host of villains that they tend to say are kind of the culprits for a lot of the reason why America's declined. And one of the really, really big tendencies within libertarianism is anti government and just anti public sector sentiment in general. And this is reflected on the belief that, there's just kind of something dirty about working in the public sector. You're not working for yourself or for, a hardworking entrepreneur. You're kind of working based off of, the people's dollar, the people's dime are funding you. And this comes into an idea that like federal workers are lazy. I think this isn't just a libertarian view. This is like a general conservative view, but libertarians really, really believe it. Um, they believe the government's lazy, it's corrupt, it's completely inefficient, it's not accountable, it can't do anything other than just get in the way of people's lives, and that essentially government workers are just lazy layabouts who never do anything and who just essentially steal money from the taxpayer to subsidize their own lifestyle instead of getting real jobs in the private sector.
Right. The government workers are like freeloaders off of the industrious private sector, which actually creates the wealth. I think that kind of to add on to that, it kind of makes sense then from that perspective why they're opposed to entitlements and welfare. They see that as, they're ill-gotten gains. They're taxing these hardworking Americans and giving it to people who aren't even working. And it's very anti-individualist. It's very pro-state and really demeans people and makes them lazy and dependent, right? This is the opposite of the sort of individualist, self-reliant man, it's the vision for libertarian conservatives. On top of that, then therefore makes sense if they're opposed to government involvement inside, they're opposed to government involvement in the economy. They believe that, the economy should be a free market capitalist one where the government intervention is minimal. There's low regulation, small, low taxes, etc. And private property rights are very much protected. And then lastly, I think on government surveillance and privacy issues, conservatives have generally been more in favor of restricting, maybe we could say privacy rights in favor of security, as shown by their push for like the Patriot Act in the 2000s. Libertarian conservatives, depending on how the libertarian you are as opposed to conservative, the more libertarian you are, the more critical you will be of these attempts at government surveillance. But libertarian conservatives can get on board with some attempts at surveillance if they think it's really in the interests of security.
Yeah, and it is interesting, definitely the divide there. There's also sort of a similar divide between different wings, like the libertarian movement when it comes to foreign policy, because you generally have some libertarians who take a very sort of, I guess you could say, like principles first view when it comes to foreign policy, and that view is like complete anti-interventionism. A lot of like libertarians like this will be opposed to what they call the welfare warfare state or the military industrial complex, basically the belief that the government takes people's money to distribute it internally or to spend it on a foreign war. Some of the more extreme ones will allege that there's like a New World Order style conspiracy. The World Economic Forum is trying to make you eat bugs, and George Soros is trying to do Agenda 2030. That's more on the fringe, but the more moderate libertarians, they still are going to be a little more hesitant about interventionism. They're a lot more transactional. They'll say, well, we aren't in favor of these whole like multinational institutions. It's almost like you're basically trying to add, like the UN's almost like another layer of government that you're trying to add on to the national government. And we already think the national government's a little too much. And they don't tend to like wars that last a very long time. That requires the government to spend money, and who funds that? The taxpayer. But still, they aren't going to be totally opposed to all foreign interventions, especially if they think it's necessary for national security or if they think it can benefit the country broadly. So there is a wide variety of viewpoints within the libertarian conservative movement on foreign policy.
Right. And I think with that, we've kind of explained most of the libertarian conservatives' beliefs, both their worldview and their specific policy points. And I think now we can dive back into the historical narrative. We had earlier where we were talking about how libertarian conservatives believe there's been this decline in liberty, and we got through the Bush administration and how libertarian conservatives were upset with the failure to restrict the growth of government. And now we've reached 2008. And at this point, the GOP is in a bit of a disarray. I mean, we should remind you that the GOP at this point isn't just libertarian conservatives. In our faction episode, we describe how the GOP before MAGA had broadly three factions. They're the social conservative Christian right people who are most focused on that issue, the neoconservatives who are most focused on a hawkish foreign policy stance, and then we have the libertarian conservatives, of course, who are most interested in, fiscal conservatism, cutting government spending, cutting government regulation, etc. And all of these groups broadly, will agree to each other's principles to some extent, but the libertarian conservatives obviously are most pressed and most upset about the growth of government. And in 2008, well, at this point, you have a lot to be upset about. Not only is there a massive economic recession that has just started, but also there's two forever wars that are going on, right? So this big government involvement. There's also these bailouts that are starting to be pulled out. Bush passes the TARP bailouts with, I think, bipartisan support. Republicans support that. So of course, libertarian conservatives are upset by, government money going to bail out private industry. And then lastly, in 2008, Obama, the Democrats just absolutely crush the Republicans. It's a wipe out. And so there's a lot of reasons to be upset at this point.
Yeah. Again, and just a quick little word on Obama moving forward. I think today a lot of people are kind of like, well, Obama's kind of a remnant of a more quaint, almost more polite era of American politics, especially considering everything that's happened in the last few years. But it's worth noting that at the time in 2008, Obama was considered, an agent of change. He literally ran the Hope and Change based campaign. And so basically, if you were a conservative, a lot of them were really freaked out by Obama, which kind of explains their reaction to him. I mean, not only is he the first black president, which definitely did play a role in their dislike of him, and we'll get to that later, but people thought that he might be overturning the entire neoliberal paradigm that had existed since Reagan. They thought he might really shift things to the left, which created this atmosphere of panic among conservative intellectuals and the conservative base.
No, for sure. And I mean, now that we've kind of understand this sort of like background, I think we can get into the Obama administration here and how libertarian conservatives react to this. So, when Obama gets elected, he does, continue the implementation of these bailouts, which are unpopular with the libertarian conservative crowd. He also increasing government spending a lot, the deficit a lot, because he's introducing this, $1 trillion stimulus package. He's trying to, stimulate the economy. But of course, libertarian conservatives ideologically disagree with that and oppose it on the grounds of, more government spending, and then it means more government taxation later, etc. And so the libertarian conservatives are kind of at a loss at this point, and the frustration kind of boils over. And this is where the Tea Party enters the scene, because these people decide they finally need to act.
Yeah, and act they do. One thing that I think is important to notice is just what exactly is the Tea Party, because we've mentioned them a lot, but we haven't really defined who they are or what they fully believe. Tea Party is actually an acronym. T stands for tax enough already. They're against big government spending, national debt, deficit. These are all issues they really care about. They believe that the government's intervened too much into the economy, both with like the TARP bailout, the Obama bailout, and then Obamacare. Increasingly, they become a more kind of focused anti-Obama group over time, though initially they were a very sort of libertarian, economically focused movement. But that begins to change as they become more socially conservative and more almost conventionally Republican over time.
Yeah, exactly. And we can kind of understand like the Tea Party as sort of to the right of most moderate Republicans. Like they're definitely the hard right faction of the Republican Party, and it can be understood as very free market, very socially conservative as well, and hardline fiscally conservative, like libertarian. We can understand the Tea Party as also this sort of like American nationalist sort of project. I mean, it's called the Tea Party to, put in your mind, remember the Tea Party, Boston Tea Party, right, from the 1770s. So this is an attempt at, we're taking back America, American values, libertarian values away from Obama's sort of liberalism, which they view as un-American. And we should also understand, as like a disclaimer, there are other libertarian conservative movements that are upset with the stimulus package and Obama's expansion of government, like Obamacare. But we're just going to call most of these sort of like anti-Obama, pro-libertarian conservative, fiscally conservative movements the Tea Party movement, just to make things more simple for everybody.
Yeah. Just going over some like basically early moments, just kind of rapid fire about like who they are and how the movement starts. Activist Kelly Carrender starts an anti-stimulus protest in February of 2009. She doesn't use the name Tea Party, but people dress in sort of like Boston Tea Party era outfits. And the term actually gets coined by CNBC correspondent Rick Santelli, who coins the term in like a viral rant in February 19th of 2009 in reaction to the homeowner affordability and stability plan. He says we're going to start a new Boston Tea Party against like this big government spending. And this term catches on, inspires a grassroots movement across the country. Glenn Beck and other commenters strengthen the movement and add sort of institutional backing to it. And so more and more people begin to show up at these town halls in support of the new Tea Party movement. There's a big taxpayer march in Washington in September 12th of 2009, which involves tens of thousands of people. And there's even Tea Party candidates who start to infiltrate and win Republican primaries and who start to oust more moderate Republicans. A very big example of this was Mike Castle, who was a long-term Republican who ended up from Delaware, who ended up losing his primary to a Tea Party challenger.
Right. So we can kind of understand this Tea Party movement started out, one small protest, at the beginning of 2009 has now ballooned into hundreds of thousands or millions of activists, grassroots activists that are now showing up across the country trying to make their voices heard. So this came up almost overnight. And I think from there, we can kind of interrogate like the characteristics of this movement. And as you can probably, guess, this movement is very grassroots. It's very decentralized, and there's a lot of ordinary people involved. And it is true that there are some big like corporate sort of backers, like the Koch brothers back, like Americans for Prosperity, a political action group that's, funding some of these groups. And there's other big groups as well. But we should understand that the main driver for this movement is definitely grassroots. They were accused of being astroturf, like just being, a bunch of guys that were paid to do this by big corporate donors. This isn't really true. Most of these people are actually genuinely, outraged by what's happening, and they're not doing this just because they were paid to do so. I think next we should understand that there's definitely a strong anti-establishment sentiment amongst the Tea Party crowd. These people are very populist. They believe the Republican establishment has been acquiescing too much to big government and to government spending. As we said, for decades, libertarian conservatives were upset, and finally they're pushed over the edge. They've been compromising too much with the Democrats, and they need to stop now. And they're going to hold them accountable. And this creates this new dichotomy between people who are Tea Party populists, like true conservatives, they're going to call themselves, versus these like moderate Republicans, we call them rhinos, Republican in name only. So there's like this purity test that started off.
Yeah, there's definitely purity testing is going to be a recurring theme, I think, throughout the history of the Tea Party and how they interact with other political factions. They definitely are a lot more bombastic and combative than their peers, that's for sure. The big example of this is Joe Wilson, who is a Republican congressperson from South Carolina, interrupts Barack Obama when he's giving a speech addressing the joint houses of Congress by shouting, "You lie," during Obama's speech, which of course sounds quaint now, but at the time was very, it was a very, very big breach of decorum. And there was a lot of criticism from both parties of his actions during that, which is funny because I wouldn't even make the headlines nowadays if someone did that. A brief aside, because I kind of mentioned it earlier. about the racial elements of the Tea Party, there is sort of a debate over whether the Tea Party is racist, whether it has racist elements. Critics will claim that the Tea Party mostly seemed to appeal to white people, and that they trafficked in a lot of racist rhetoric, such as particularly birtherism, which was a popular belief among Tea Party adherents, at least more popular than it was among the general public. There was a poll taken in April 2010, which said that 30% of Tea Party supporters believe that Obama was not born in the United States, compared to 20% of overall US adults. So it definitely isn't completely out of the question to argue that people were in the Tea Party who were motivated by racism against Barack Obama for being the first black president. But there were also others who were there as part of a genuine libertarian political movement. After all, it's 30% of Tea Party supporters instead of, say, like 60 or 70%. So there definitely is, you could say, a racial undercurrent to the Tea Party. I don't think that's deniable. But you also, I don't think, can say that the movement itself was entirely a racial one.
Right. And I think from there, we can then get a deep dive into the demographics of the Tea Party support base. So the Tea Party is actually pretty popular when it starts out, at least. About 41% of Americans have a good favorability of the Tea Party in 2010, compared to the Democratic Party at 35%, the Republicans at 28%. A little over a third of Americans identified with the Tea Party in 2010. And most of these Tea Party people are, pretty, not only are they populists, but they're actually not, in one homogenous group. There are three major factions, broadly speaking. There are hard right-wing conservative Republicans who are outraged by Republican compromises. There are newcomers to politics who are upset about the economy and what's happening. And then there are independents who are also upset about fiscal issues. Overall, we can say the Tea Party is very hard right on both economic and social issues, except for some of those hardcore libertarian conservative people who are a little more moderate on social issues. Additionally, we can also say that the Tea Party has actually somewhat of a bipartisan favorability. Like 20% to 30% of Tea Partiers voted for Obama. And there's also some interesting similarities to the MAGA movement that'll come out later, including their bombastic style, their accusations of, Republicans being rhinos and being confrontational. And I think lastly, important to mention is Tea Partiers are generally middle class, maybe middle to upper middle class. They're more likely to be college educated than the average American. 80% are white. And they're generally from rural Midwest, South, and West, at least for the typical Tea Partier.
Yeah. Just a little bit about the overall worldview of the party, since we talked about its demographics and its early history. The Tea Party is a populist movement, and this is the first time we could probably say, at least in the 21st century, that populism is a real force in American politics. Metrics of support for institutions have been declining since 2008. A lot of Americans just don't trust the establishment anymore. Rasmussen polling was quoted as saying that, quote, "For the first time in recent history, the majority of Americans now qualify as populists." This was in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And there's just this pervasive sense that the government just doesn't work, that the political parties don't serve the people, that they're only interested in lining their own pockets. Tea Party supporters don't trust either parties. They think that none of them really listen to the people anymore. And essentially, there really is a sense that no one feels that anything can be accomplished in Washington, and that you need an outside force to come and shake things up.
Yeah, and this feeling that the government does not and the elites don't listen to you speaks to a broader sense that there's a lack of fairness in America, and Tea Partiers are especially hard on this point. We should understand that Tea Partiers, as we said, are generally middle class, and they feel that they're the average average everyman American, and they're getting squeezed by the upper and lower class. I think we understand this. The upper class is getting bailed out, like the Wall Street guys are getting bailed out, and they're getting away with all their mistakes. And the lower classes, poorer people are on welfare that Obama is now expanding dramatically. And the middle class people, well, they're losing their jobs and no one's helping them. So they feel like they're getting squeezed out. they feel a sense really that they're being cheated. The government will just take your money, tax you, and then will spend it on these stimulus programs, these bailouts that you don't get. That money does not come back to you. They'll spend it on their special interests, their lobbyists, their Wall Street buddies, etc., but they will not care about you. And really, this means that America is no longer the fair meritocratic place it was supposed to be. The American dream is now gone. You're not upwardly mobile anymore. You just probably lost your house, you lost your job, it's 2008, and the government does not want to help you. They're caring for their own buddies. Yeah, very sad.
Yeah. No, that's a very, I think it's a very strong statement about like what the libertarians believe sort of within their own mythology of how they think America has developed. And you can see there really is this focus on patriotism. America is supposed to be a land of opportunity, a unique land of opportunity, sort of mirroring the libertarian view about the American founding that we mentioned earlier in this episode, and that these big government actions are really not American. There's this big criticism of Obama that he thought he was sort of too good for the American people, especially people on the right believed this. This sometimes manifests itself in weird ways, such as I think it was Sean Hannity getting mad at Barack Obama for ordering Dijon mustard on a hot dog one time because he said that it made Barack Obama seem like an elitist. But even though that is a admittedly very stupid thing to criticize the president for, it speaks to an opinion that a lot of conservatives had about Obama and about liberals in general, that liberals just didn't like America and they wanted to make America like Europe by taking away the freedom that Americans had and replacing it with like big government nanny state handouts. And so you can see that the opposition to taxation to government is more on nationalistic grounds rather than just like libertarian grounds. They don't care about the economics of it. They care a lot more about what taxation and government programs say about the character of the country rather than necessarily balance sheets or economics or something like that.
Yeah, and that's definitely going to have implications for the future when we get to the MAGA movement, nationalism being an important reason for opposing the Democratic Party. But I think lastly, we should touch off some other grievances. There are some long-term grievances that probably are influencing the Tea Party as well as other populists in America, like globalization and deindustrialization causing mass dislocations. There may be failing schools. Some people, maybe white identitarians, are upset about demographic transformation. There's also lots of concerns about illegal immigration that are becoming popular at this point. I mean, we forget that illegal immigration was already a hot button issue before, Trump appeared on the scene. And maybe also the increasing social liberalization of the country that's happening in the 2010s. And I think then lastly, we should talk about the economy is really bad, right? This is a good reason to join the Tea Party. You feel like America's losing its path because it's adopting, these European alien ideas. Maybe you're upset because you love, free market and limited government. But there's another thing you could be mad about, and it's just that the economic recovery is terrible.
The economy sucks. It's terrible.
Right. And it just does not get better once Obama gets elected. The hope and change does not happen. In January 2009, by the way, when Obama gets into office, the unemployment rate is at 7.8%. In November 2010, during the midterms, it's 9.8%. So it's actually gone worse. And it will be at 7.8% again. So it'll go down a little bit in October of 2012 on the eve of the next presidential elections. So things are not improving and people are mad. And if you also care about the deficit, oh boy, it's even worse. The deficit as a percent of GDP was 3% in 2008. And then in 2009, it gets almost to 10% and will not get below 3% until 2014. So the American people and many of these Tea Partiers will say they were promised change, but Obama said hope and change, right? But the recovery is incredibly slow and painful. And people expected more from Obama. Like, no matter what you think about Obama's policies, whether they were good or bad, many people just felt that it wasn't enough. He wasn't doing the right things to help them.
Yeah. And so, you might say, okay, the economy's bad. How are the Tea Party going to react to this? What are they going to get out of this? And the answer is they're going to get a whole lot out of it because the 2010 midterms are a big test of Tea Party strength, and it's a test that they really pass with flying colors, and it shows that their infiltration of Republican Party primaries has really, really started to yield results. There is a widespread dissatisfaction during the 2010 midterms among independents towards the Democratic administration. a lot of enthusiasm and grassroots support for Tea Party candidates. People are mad about Obamacare, the economy, the budget, about immigration, all the things that Muhammad just mentioned. And so a lot of independent voters who are motivated by these populist issues decide, well, the momentum with the populism seems to be more on the right now. I'm going to vote for the Tea Party candidates who are all Republicans. And so Republicans end up getting a lot of support for their party, and the 2010 midterms are an absolute bloodbath for the Democrats that you can argue that they still haven't really recovered from. And there's a question of, did the Tea Party really help the Republicans that much? After all, the incumbent party always loses seats during the midterms, and they weren't doing that well anyways. The plus side is that, for the Republicans at least, is that the Tea Party brought out a huge turnout of really enthusiastic supporters. The downside is that you might have said that moderate candidates might have had a better chance in a lot of swing districts, and that sometimes the Tea Party candidates might have been a little too enthusiastic about certain less popular conservative principles, and they might have turned off certain people. However, you have to remember that midterm election turnouts are generally pretty low. And so even if you do have a more radical support base, if they want to actually come out and vote for you in large numbers, I think that's generally able to help you a lot more than it will in a presidential election. So I think broadly you could say that at least in 2010, the Tea Party does help out the Republicans a lot.
Right. And just to give you an example of how important this election was, this was a momentous election, one of the most important midterms that we've had in recent decades. A lot of famous faces got elected for the first time to Congress or to public office for the first time, like Rand Paul, Senator from Kentucky, Marco Rubio from Florida, Tim Scott and Nikki Haley in South Carolina, Mike Lee, Utah, and Scott Brown, Massachusetts. All these Tea Party, famous Tea Party people. They might not stick with the Tea Party, but these were all first-time Tea Party candidates. And just to rattle off some statistics, give you an idea of how big this victory was, the Republicans gained a net 62 House seats. That's huge. Mm-hmm. They take control of the House. They gained net 6 seats in the Senate. They gained net 6 governorships. They even gained net 20 state legislative chambers. And the Republicans finally start destroying what remains of Democratic Party strength in the South that had gone back basically the 1800s. The Democrats used to basically own the South, and we might think, the South is now always Republicans. Well, no, it was until very recently that was not the case. But the Republicans finally kick out a lot of the longtime Southern Democrats that had been there, and this really points to just the scale of the victory. Independents hold Democrats, Obama, responsible for not being able to fix the economy, and they decided to go with the Republicans and the Tea Party momentum. The Tea Party message was very popular and spoke to a lot of people, and that led to a huge victory.
Yeah, I mean, you can even see today the Democrats never gained back the momentum. The Democrats are now still essentially the party of certain majority minority districts, of cities and of coastal areas. And a lot of these inland areas or these parts of the Midwest and the South, they lose in this election, they never get it back again. And it's a big sea change in American politics, and we're still living with the results of it even today in terms of districts that are competitive and which ones aren't. And so the Tea Party is naturally ecstatic about this. Rand Paul says in his election victory speech, and I'm quoting directly, "As government explodes at a rate unprecedented in our history, the Tea Party's critics continue to portray the movement as too radical. If the Constitution and common sense still have any bearing, the Tea Party isn't the least bit radical. The federal government is. From the founding fathers to Barry Goldwater to my father, Ron Paul, conservatives today always pointed out that the primary purpose of government is to protect our liberties." So you can tell they're really feeling themselves after this most recent victory.
Right. And as Rand Paul said, now is the time we're going to roll back that big government that Obama has just, exploded in their minds. So I think then we can take a look at, well, what did the Tea Party do now that they're in power? So first off, there's the creation of the Tea Party caucus, and they're, that's going to be created in Congress. Michelle Bachmann is going to be its first leader. And now that they have these members in Congress, they decide that they are going to act to force Republicans to agree to their agenda. Their MO is they're going to influence the Republican leadership and congressmen to push for less compromise with Democrats, push for less government spending and lower taxes. So their strategy is more a strategy of influence and combativeness, and maybe you could argue like almost confrontation rather than trying to seize control of the party.
Yeah, and I guess the first big example of that is the 2011 debt ceiling crisis, which involves a lot of notable Tea Party participation. Essentially, the Tea Parties and the Republicans used their new majority in the House to play hardball, and they refused to allow any tax increases. And in the ensuing chaos and the negotiations that resulted from it, they end up getting a lot of what they want in terms of budget and deficit cuts. And this is kind of one of the first of a series of US debt ceiling crises. And I mean, they're an issue we still continue to deal with to this day. I can't remember the last time a debt ceiling crisis happened, but I think it was a few years ago, if I'm not mistaken, Mohammed.
Right, 3 years ago.
Yeah. So, anyways, it's a thing that has continued to
Close.
happen, but this is the first time that it was really a major issue. Almost $1 trillion would be cut over the next 10 years, and in exchange, the debt ceiling would be raised by $1 trillion. And budget sequestration would be introduced if the spending cuts couldn't be found. And the Tea Party were pretty happy about this result, but a lot of Americans didn't really like this. They thought that the bricksmanship that the Tea Party did, like threatening to just have the U.S. default on its debt, this was considered a kind of a bridge too far, and so the popularity of the Tea Party starts to drop. Unfavorability for Tea Party actually increases from 25% to 49% during this crisis, and only 35% of Americans are going to view the Tea Party favorably after this.
Right. So I guess we can summarize the Tea Party when they get in power their first 2 years, they're able to make use of their influence. They're push the GOP leadership to play hardball, to, use the threat of the debt crisis, defaulting on the debt to grab concessions from the Democrats. And they are able to get some concessions to get the Democrats to reduce spending, but at the cost of looking very, very bad to most Americans. And I think from here we can turn to the 2012 elections, because this is the moment the Tea Party is kind of hoping they can, actually take on Obama directly, right? By getting their guy to be the Republican candidate. But unfortunately, things don't quite turn out that way. The Republican primary in 2012 is kind of stacked against them in some sense because they don't have any good candidates yet. Remember, their candidates have only gotten to Congress like 2 years ago, so none of them are really have like the high profile recognition or experience necessary yet. They do have two candidates who kind of align with the Tea Party: Newt Gingrich and Ron Paul.
Ron Paul 2012.
Right, Ron Paul 2012. But Ron Paul is like very libertarian and not really conservative, like very libertarian. So he's seen as quite extreme. And Newt Gingrich is best seen as kind of like an opportunist. And he hasn't been in politics in a while. So these candidates don't do so well, actually. Ron Paul wins only 11% of the popular vote in the primary. Newt Gingrich is a little better at 14%. But Mitt Romney, the moderate Republican candidate, actually wins half of the primary vote, and a Christian right guy, going back to that whole fusionist, social conservative, fiscal conservative marriage, a Christian right guy, the social conservative side, won 20% still. So it looks like politics hasn't really changed much on the right.
Yeah, although that's not to say the libertarians get nothing out of this, because after all, Paul Ryan, who's sort of a close Tea Party affiliate, gets picked as Romney's VP, and Romney does lean into some Tea Party positions, but it kind of leaves the more extreme stuff to the side. So this definitely is a sign of influence. They might not be powerful enough to take over the party, but at least they have to be acknowledged with the VP position. However, Romney loses. He does better than McCain does in 2008, but Obama still wins decisively, even with the economy being kind of exactly the same place where it was in 2008. The Dems keep the Senate. They actually gain 2 seats, and they gain 8 in the House of Reps, but they don't flip it. Republicans gain net 1 governorship, and the Democrats regain 3 legislative chambers. In 2012, in contrast to 2010, the Tea Party is probably a liability. Their candidates are painted as extreme, and after the whole debt ceiling thing, a lot of Americans are really inclined to believe that. The GOP loses ground in Congress. Even though the economy is still bad, they still lose the presidency. And only about a quarter of the candidates of the Tea Party are putting up for Senate actually end up winning. there is an argument that their extreme polarizing stances were unpopular and that they were dragging down the Republicans and Romney in an election that maybe they might have actually been able to win.
Right. Some people really did think, Romney's running at a time when unemployment's still like 8%. Surely he would have won. The Tea Party position is really somewhat popular, but no, actually. So maybe the Tea Party is not quite as influential or popular as people thought. And I think from here now we can start turning towards the late Tea Party, roughly the years like 2012 to 2016. And I think we can characterize this period where the Tea Party is still there. Their movement becomes more institutionalized. They're now becoming more comfortable with government. But the initial sort of momentum or popularity or energy we saw in 2010, like that town hall stuff and those big protests, is kind of lost. And the Tea Party, I think, getting right into it, in this period is becoming more and more a general anti-Obama group that is upset about the social liberalism, immigration, etc., the social issues really that the Democrats and Obama are pushing. That's not to say that they still aren't focused on some fiscal issues. In 2013, there's the fiscal cliff that happens, which forces budget sequestration and eventually leads to another debt ceiling crisis and government shutdown. It's the same playbook as 2011. The Tea Party, again, tries to hold, they're, in their view, trying to hold the Republican leadership accountable. They press the Republicans to, really play hardball on the debt ceiling issue, force the Democrats to cut spending, cut taxes. But they're not really that successful. They are able to get some spending cuts. It's really forcing verifications on Obamacare spending. But by and large, the Republicans look really bad for this. GOP is blamed. Tea Party favorability really drops a lot because of this yet again.
Yeah, so we can kind of see after 2012, the Tea Party is really entering their kind of Elvis in Vegas era. Lots of sequins, lots of breathy renditions of Suspicious Minds. Not exactly what they once were, but the Republicans are still having broadly a pretty good time. In 2014, they gain another 9 Senate seats and 13 House seats, 3 governorships, and 11 state legislature chambers at the midterms. So it's a big election year. But if you kind of scratch the surface, they're not winning because of the Tea Party. In fact, there are not really that many new Tea Party candidates emerging. And these people who are winning elections are establishment Republicans, the exact same people the Tea Party thought that the party was sick of. And it turns out maybe they were not quite as sick of them as the Tea Party supporters might have assumed. There's generally low turnout. The Democrats did poorly in vulnerable races. And so essentially it's further proof that even though the American people might not have been willing to elect a Republican president, they're still not super happy with how things have turned out with Obama. Though there is one big win that the Tea Party manages to pull. They renamed themselves the Freedom Caucus in 2015, by the way, which is their current name to this day. But this win that the Freedom Caucus does is they get John Boehner, who is the Speaker of the House, to resign. And they ended up getting Paul Ryan, who is Romney's VP, to come in and replace him. So this is a sign that at least within Congress, the Tea Party, even though they're not dominating the Republican Party, they didn't take it over. Again, if they throw their weight around, they can make things happen.
Right. Like Paul Ryan is like a Tea Party adjacent guy, and Boehner doesn't really like the Tea Party. Boehner's not like a moderate Republican, but he's very anti-Tea Party. But the Tea Partiers are still able to get this Tea Party adjacent guy in power, which shows that Tea Party's maybe lost some of its momentum, but it's not out for sure. It's not out. But I think at this point, we need to start asking, okay, why does the Tea Party kind of fail in its main objectives? Why is its enthusiasm drying up? Why is the GOP sort of establishment able to keep control of the party? I mean, the GOP establishment basically runs the 2014 elections and does well without the Tea Party sort of platform. So why is the Tea Party not as successful as they ought to be? I think the first thing we need to look at is this is a grassroots movement in theory, and grassroots movements oftentimes run out of steam, especially if they're very, they're very decentralized and lack like a central unifying figure that can push on the party. I mean, compare this maybe to Trump's MAGA movement, right? Trump is a central leader that's able to push the Republican Party as he sees fit, but the Tea Party has many different leaders. It's a grassroots movement, doesn't have that same level of coordination. I think the
Yeah.
other, yeah,
Well,
I think
I was just gonna say they don't get a presidential candidate in 2012. They're running
right,
essentially in midterm elections, and that's harder to mobilize people around than it is for a presidential election. Trump at least can go out and say, "Hey, it's me, your boy Donald. Like, vote for me." And we even noticed that in elections where Trump isn't running, MAGA tends to not do very well.
right. Way easier to vote for that one presidential, candidate rather than all these 50 different like Tea Party candidates for sure. No,
Yeah, it
yeah, I mean,
doesn't. Sorry, continue.
no, I was just gonna say, I mean, like this, there's also clearly the fact that they're a bit unpopular. They are unpopular with many Americans because of their, maybe their drastic, combative, partisan stances on the debt ceiling standoffs, the government shutdowns, etc. You could even argue that the GOP leadership really weaponizes this to marginalize the Tea Party and prevent them from taking power, like in 2014. Their big government spending platform is not maybe as popular as you might think. I mean, Obamacare gets, enacted into law, and then some of the Republicans find it kind of hard to get rid of it, and they find it hard to think of an alternative. So maybe the sort of like liberal direction of the country isn't as unpopular as the Tea Partiers thought, and maybe they have a strong opponent.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's kind of just this fatigue that develops among a lot of Tea Party people. They kind of say, okay, the Tea Party's getting a lot of money through all these super PACs, and sure, they're getting some seats, but they didn't take over the party like they said they were going to. It kind of just seems like they're just another business as usual Republican faction, more conservative, sure, than some of the other ones, but still not that different from the norm. And this isn't necessarily a mistaken view. The Tea Party does become institutionalized and more mainstream within the Republican Party. The Republican Party becomes more partisan, right wing, and populist. It takes on a lot of the Tea Party's characteristics. Even more kind of conventional Republicans like Mitch McConnell start to talk like Tea Party people. So you
Right.
can say its success in molding the party kind of becomes the reason why it loses its salience. At this point, you can't rail against the establishment if the establishment has your positions, talks like you, and doesn't substantively disagree with you on anything.
Right. So co-opting the Tea Party language and policies may have diluted the salience of the Tea Party. And in a similar way, maybe same thing with the issues, right? The deficit, right, does get quite substantially reduced after the initial like stimulus packages that Obama spends 2009. And so maybe that makes it a lot harder to rally around this issue. The deficit gets reduced substantially, not completely, but substantially. And same thing with the economy. The economy was really bad 2008, 2009, 2010. That really helped the Tea Party mobilize support, right? But by 2014, 2015, 2016, maybe the economy isn't awesome, but certainly is a hell of a lot better. And that kind of prevents a lot of people from turning out and supporting the Tea Party.
Yeah, so this again creates this feeling of betrayal. The Tea Party got betrayed by its initial leaders, got betrayed by the GOP elites, betrayed just by everyone essentially, and their movement got corrupted into just another part of the GOP establishment. People say that all these Tea Party politicians who promised they weren't going to surrender an inch now are cozying up to congressional leadership. Marco Rubio is suddenly a lot more moderate going into like the around the 2016 era. There's a lot of relationships established now between Tea Party PACs and more normal Republican PACs.
Hmm.
And so the Tea Party goes from rebellious and independent to just being the GOP. And this creates resentment naturally among the Tea Party base who kind of feel like they've been lied to. they thought that the movement was betrayed and that in the future they're going to need someone who's maybe a little farther to the right than the Tea Party.
Right. I mean, the revolution got a little too institutionalized, so to speak, and became less of a revolution, more like, normal times, things as normal, right? And therefore, the Republican base, which for a variety of reasons we're going to get into over the next few episodes, is not happy and content with the status quo and feels like, well, you guys just became the establishment, or you guys aren't doing anything to help me, or you guys are weak or failures. So this is going to lead to a lingering resentment amongst the GOP base that will explode out in the 2016 primary. Now, the party of Boehner and Mitt Romney, they those kinds of people kept control of the party up through 2016. The Tea Party couldn't really replace them. Maybe instead they cozy up to them. But after 2016, this will definitely not be the party of Romney. This will be the party of something else.
Yeah, plus they didn't get rid of Obama. He's still there. He's a radical leftist from Kenya. He was smoking crack. He was apparently he was everything under the sun. He was a drug dealer. He was part of the New World Order. He was maybe a prostitute. Who knows? They believed crazy stuff about Obama, and the fact was they couldn't get rid of him. He served 2 terms and then just went off into the sunset, like every other president. So they kind of felt like, well, what the hell, guys? This was like the one thing we were supposed to do. And so, again, naturally, they're saying, well, if this didn't work, I guess we're going to have to do something else.
Right. Yeah, especially the conspiracy-tinged aspects of the Tea Party birtherists were upset, but everyone is generally upset by the failure of the Tea Party. And once we get into 2016, we can start understanding the libertarian sort of conservative populist movement, the Tea Party. This entire project is starting to get subsumed and then gets completely sidelined, honestly, by the MAGA movement. And this is a historical moment in American conservatism, really in American history. We will talk more at the end of the episode, but to give a short understanding, the Tea Party and the establishment, like fusionist Republican Party, that marriage between social conservatism and fiscal conservatism, limited government sort of politics, finally gets eclipsed. For the first time in American history, limited government is not the centerpiece of American conservative beliefs. The Republican Party gets taken over by the Trump's MAGA movement, America First movement, and he takes the core of the party away from limited government and towards a sort of nationalist, national conservative, sort of a nativist core. At least the Tea Party, you could argue, is really just doubling down really strongly on existing beliefs of the party, fusionist, socially conservative, fiscally conservative beliefs. But the MAGA movement just drops the limited government sort of core of American philosophy, libertarian philosophy, and completely changes it and pushes it in a new direction.
Yeah, and that's a really, really notable thing about MAGA. And when we do the MAGA episode, we're going to get more into this. But again, it's interesting. It's kind of a natural through line from what maybe the disappointed former members of the Tea Party had experienced into thinking, well, we tried libertarianism, but it wasn't enough. We need to try someone harder who isn't going to give in, who maybe might use underhanded or, kind of corrupt tactics, or maybe use the power of the government against our cultural enemies who've ruined this country so much. And you can really see the appeal of this in the 2016 primary. And the Tea Party candidates do run in this primary. There are several viable Tea Party candidates in 2016, including Cruz, sort of Marco Rubio, and Rand Paul again. Cruz gets 25%, Rubio gets 11%, which is better than 2012. If you combine those vote totals and assume that they're both sort of Tea Party support, that's now 36%. But it doesn't change the fact that Trump wins decisively with 45%. So it seems like a solid third or so of Republicans are planning to stick with the Tea Party like Cruz, but eventually they end up splitting the vote with the moderate Republicans and they end up handing sort of the primary to MAGA. There is this kind of weird last-ditch attempt to try to get an anti-Trump unity candidate to win, but it fizzles out. There just wasn't enough support behind it, and it was too little too late. Trump's MAGA is just more popular to the Republican base than the Tea Party or the establishment is. And so Ted Cruz bites the bullet. He endorses Trump in September and has been a solid ally of him ever since. And after that, you can say the Tea Party movement kind of begins to really, really lose steam. They kind of begin to dissolve after Trump's victory because they're now no longer the populist top dog in town. They're old news.
Right. And I mean, like going off what you said, Jackson, I mean, it's you mentioned there, right? Like the Tea Party and the moderate Republican establishment sort of people actually briefly tried to unite, first under Rubio, then under Cruz, to stop Trump. And that really shows just how desperate, the old guard Republicans and the Tea Partiers are to stop MAGA, and just how alien they think MAGA is as a force at the beginning, at least. So we got to ask ourselves, why is MAGA so popular to Republican voters who just a few years ago were voting for very different candidates? They go from Romney and Ron Paul, and then suddenly they're voting for Trump. So like, why? We got to ask, why is the Tea Party basically dissolve? Why do they end up supporting MAGA? In fact, Tea Party supporters are, according to a Pew Research poll, they're actually more likely to support Trump than non-Tea Party Republicans by 2019. So like, why is this? We got to ask ourselves.
Yeah, well, I mean, one very notable reason is they're tired of losing. After all, and if you're tired of losing, why not support a guy who's a winner? In fact, he's going to make you win so much you might even get tired of winning.
I'm getting tired of winning.
Yeah, I think we're all very tired of winning in this country at this point. I'd like to start losing soon, please. But you can see sort of these changing priorities towards a more sort of harsher, more hardline social conservative belief. And this has been happening within the Tea Party as even before Trump, as it sort of transitioned more away from libertarian economics and more towards anti-Obama, anti-illegal immigration stuff. But it really does seem, especially by 2016, people are willing to throw the libertarian economics thing fully out the window. Nobody cares anymore, or at the very least, not enough people care to win a primary, which is really what matters here. And this is a general shift away from fiscal conservatism that we see among a lot of conservatives and towards social and cultural issues. And you can see this even in the framing that MAGA uses. They say that they're not really there to conserve like limited government principles, which is what a lot of early Tea Party people said. They said they're here to preserve national sovereignty and American culture away from people who want to destroy it. This is a big shift, actually. This is a shift from a sort of more traditional MAGA, or more traditional Republican worldview of, preserving kind of traditions towards a more radical view of kind of reinventing America in a way that is going to preserve the parts that they like, in part actually through changing the country and how the government relates to its people. MAGA is willing to be really top down in a way that conservatives just haven't really been willing to do in American history before then. And Mohammed, do you want to talk a little bit about why this is so fundamental? Because I think I haven't really done it justice.
Yeah, no, I think we can say that, we started at the beginning of this episode talking about how the essence of American conservatism really has been limited government, libertarian-esque sort of philosophy, right? Like that is what America was founded on. That's what the founding fathers fought for. They fought for individual rights, limited government, etc. And this is what American conservatives are going to believe in all throughout the 19th century, all through the 20th century, and up through the Tea Party being the latest manifestation of this belief. And it's not until 2016 when finally, for the first time ever, the Republicans drop this platform. They drop the essence of American conservatism and redefine conservatism as something else. They think the stakes are higher in a sense. They think that America is in imminent peril of being subsumed by, liberal cultural values, national sovereignty being undermined by globalists, etc. And they sort of adopt new values that are very different from what they've always believed in, nativist, national conservative sort of values. So this is the real meaning of the change. This is the big change, away from American conservative being about limited government, free markets, fiscal conservatism, towards American conservatism meaning national sovereignty, nationalism, nativism.
Yeah, and we're going to go into a lot more depth in all of those things on our National Conservative episodes, so stay tuned for that. But it really isn't, it definitely sounds crazy like to jump from those beliefs to sort of the new ones, but if you really kind of scratch below the surface, there are a lot of similarities between MAGA and the Tea Party, which imply why people might jump from one to another. They're both populists. They basically have the same rhetorical style. MAGA just like turns it up from like 6 to an 11 in terms of how bombastic they want to be. They're both anti-immigration. They both kind of play on nativist sentiment. I mean, birtherism, interestingly, it's popular among the Tea Party, and it's in a large part spread by Donald Trump himself.
Right.
Even before he's running, Donald Trump is a very, very big proponent of birtherism. So in a way, Trump has always been kind of stoking these flames of nativist tendencies, even back when the conservative populists were with the Tea Party. There's both this kind of feeling of persecution and of decline, that America is being taken from them, that it just isn't fair anymore. And at the end of the day, one kind of has to come to the conclusion that the libertarian economics and all that whole thing about preserving American liberty might have just been a front for social and cultural issues, and sort of more what those beliefs represented about America rather than the minutiae of economic policy. Yeah, believe it or not, voters might not actually care about macro and microeconomics. They might just care about, like, I don't know, who gets to use the bathroom or how many Guatemalans are crossing over the border at any given year.
You meant how many Guatemalans are at the Lincoln Memorial, right? No, I'm joking.
Exactly. There's currently 5 million of them tearing down the statue of Lincoln right now.
Right. I mean, I will push back a little bit perhaps on that. I do think that, yes, I agree with you, Jackson. There are these clear similarities between the two, and clearly voters ended up shifting their focus away from fiscal issues, especially. They don't, perhaps it's kind of true, they don't care as much about what exactly is the deficit as a percent of GDP, and they started shifting towards cultural issues over time. I would definitely agree with you, but I do think certainly the Tea Partiers did care about limited government. They certainly did care about fiscal issues. I think what kind of happened is the MAGA message was just touched them to the core, perhaps far more seriously than the, fiscal conservative message did. And it had this message that was wrapped in American nationalist sort of aesthetic that was far more appealing, maybe in a sense, and had a lot of similarities to the Tea Party's beginning. Again, the Tea Partiers opposed a lot of Obama's, bailout stuff because they thought, and the big deficit in spending, because this seemed un-American to them, right? And that isn't such a big stretch to then start thinking about, America's, being taken away from me, and maybe we should start thinking about how America is going the wrong way in other ways, right? So, like, for sure, voters don't care as much about, the minutiae of economic policy, but you can definitely see the logic here, right? Like, it's not crazy to go down this line.
Yeah, you're right. If you already do kind of believe in a decline narrative, it's very difficult to keep the decline narrative focused on just one thing. It kind of begins to become more pervasive. It's not just there's one thing wrong with the country that's dragging it down. It becomes kind of a symptom of a larger set of or constellation of problems. And the belief in what those problems are can eventually cohere into a worldview or even a movement. And we've been talking a bit about how, MAGA replaced the Tea Party and the Tea Party isn't relevant anymore. But that's not to say that MAGA doesn't have elements of the Tea Party DNA still within them. There are parts of MAGA that were kind of lifted from the Tea Party, you can say. One example is the support for tax cuts, and support for deregulation and opposition to climate action. And so these things are just things the Tea Party supported, like, straight up. There isn't really much of a difference there. There is also, though, a difference on other things, such as government spending. MAGA is willing very much to kind of like blow up the federal deficit. Government power. MAGA is willing to use government power a lot more than the Tea Party people were willing to. And free trade. Tea Party was generally pro-free trade. MAGA is definitely against it.
Right. So, like, clearly there's some through lines, like this classic GOP and classic Tea Party with this tax cuts and deregulation, but also things have changed. Like, there's no more we're going against free trade. We're in favor of big government power, etc. And this kind of extends also to the realm of foreign policy, where the MAGA, at least very much in theory, given the Iran war that is occurring right now, but in theory, the MAGA movement was premised on, we don't want any more of these forever wars. We only want to fight wars that are actually in our interests. We're suspicious of getting entangled in these big foreign wars. We don't want to pursue things that are not in our interests. We want to do transactional foreign policy, get things that we actually need. Now, again, as a reminder, maybe perhaps this didn't go exactly as planned, but this is sort of a view that kind of jives with the libertarian conservative view we were talking about earlier, which is they're a little suspicious about getting involved in long quagmires. Trump even said on his election night speech, "I'm not going to start a war. I'm going to stop wars." And that has aged like milk. But
exactly. Even by the standard of normal Trump statements, that one has aged impressively poorly.
Right. But this is definitely what MAGA people and just people who voted for Donald Trump in 2024 believed in for sure.
Yeah, well, Mohammed, first off, I'm really disappointed by your lack of faith in the president. He's planning a 100D chess move, and it might seem on the surface like he's an idiot who doesn't know what he's doing, but you have to trust the plan. It's all going to come together any day now. You just got to wait. You just got to wait. But in all seriousness, another similarity is, at least during COVID, there's a big kind of like libertarian style opposition to big government in terms of the masks, the lockdowns, the vaccines. This kind of does begin to merge with like more like loony, like New World Order stuff, like microchips in the vaccines and George Soros, Bill Gates, and that is accepted, by the way, to a degree more than what some of the earlier kind of fringe libertarian things were. Like vaccine skepticism is a lot more common under MAGA than it was under, say, the Tea Party, for example. There's also a shared opposition to government elites, the bureaucrats, the deep state, just a general suspicion towards people like that. Though it's a little different because for the libertarians, the opposition to government work was kind of more from a abstract principle that the public sector just wasn't efficient, or that it was taking away hardworking Americans' money. And that definitely is the thing that MAGA believes too. But MAGA has an additional element to it where they also believe that the federal government and the federal workforce is part of like a nefarious plot to undermine Donald Trump himself. And that the reason why he didn't do as much stuff as he wanted during the first term was because he was being actively impeded by disloyal federal bureaucrats. So that was kind of another reason for MAGA disliking the federal bureaucracy that goes beyond just thinking that they're lazy, although they also think that too.
Right. So, I mean, you can see Doge, Elon Musk's role in, trying to slash government spending and government, workforce, et cetera, as kind of extension of these libertarian sort of beliefs. And I think from there, we kind of have an understanding, there's a continuation of libertarian conservative populist elements within MAGA, the populist style, the focus on America is under threat, American values under threat, the tax cuts, suspicion of foreign wars, anti-lockdown stuff, anti-big government sort of elitism sort of stuff. But we got to start understanding that most libertarian conservatives, in all truth, become really part of the MAGA movement, or at the very least have to sort of like kowtow and accept the MAGA movement and Donald Trump's control over the party. Most remaining libertarian conservatives or Tea Party people are going to support MAGA. In fact, they actually become more enthusiastic supporters than the average Republican. So we can look at people like Ted Cruz, as someone who's like, he was a Tea Party person. He very much hated Trump in 2016, but then he gets on board with the MAGA movement and is actually pretty in favor of it. And this really just speaks to just how powerful the MAGA movement is. If you're a libertarian conservative, you kind of just have to accept that MAGA has taken over the party.
Yeah, and that's not to say that MAGA doesn't try to buck Trump sometimes. After all, people might, have not fully remember this because it seems like so long ago. But after Jan 6, there was kind of a brief weakening of Trump's hold over the GOP just because of how bad that incident was. And I do mean in the immediate aftermath, because the wagons circle around Trump pretty fast after that. But you do start to see some Republicans being like, okay, we like MAGA broadly, but Trump, he kind of needs to go. He's too much of a liability. He's too mercurial at this point. And so a lot of people kind of rally around DeSantis, especially a lot of former Tea Party people. And so there's sort of this idea that, well, maybe we can get MAGA without Trump, or maybe Trumpism without Trump, get the good stuff and leave the bad. This doesn't work. Plainly, it might be because DeSantis isn't a good candidate. It might be that broadly a lot of conservatives just still really like Trump even after Jan 6th. But it is interesting that even in this sort of like last ditch attempt to shake off Trump, it they have to do it by adopting a kind of soft MAGA like policy platform. This isn't a rejection of MAGA by any means. It was an attempted rejection of Trump, which shows that even when they disagree with MAGA, libertarians have still internalized MAGA to an extent that they hadn't before.
Right. I mean, Ron DeSantis is a good example of this. Like, he is an OG Tea Party person, and he's like kind of broadly speaking adjacent to the libertarian conservative areas. So he's their guy. But he has to adopt MAGA positions, especially like culture war sort of positions, and his style has to be MAGAfied in a sense in order to stay relevant. And this kind of shows that libertarian conservatives, you know, when you enter the MAGA area, really have two choices, really. You either have to embrace some level of MAGA ideology, people like DeSantis and Ted Cruz, right, to stay relevant. Or if you're going to really stick to your guns and you're going to be like, well, if MAGA is going to do big government stuff, I oppose that. So if you're like Rand Paul or Thomas Massie, you basically get to fade into the background and become less relevant. So Trump's hold in the GOP is clearly strong. Now, not to say that there aren't still some Tea Party institutions that are left over, like the Freedom Caucus, which was the Tea Party caucus initially, still does continue, still has some libertarian conservative people. It's been now infiltrated by MAGA people. But there are some libertarian conservative sort of people in there, like MTG, who is a prominent member until very recently. And the Freedom Caucus is able to actually wield some power. They torpedo McCarthy's speakership in 2023 and were a big part of that near debt ceiling crisis in 2023. But even then, I mean, people like MTG, while very limited government, very constitutionalist, very, you know, libertarian, they themselves are very MAGA as well. So that kind of shows you have to adopt some level of MAGA to stay relevant in the modern GOP.
Yeah, we're nearing the end of the episode, and so I think we can move now more to the analysis section, just kind of summing up and putting together a lot of what we've talked about. And so I think one interesting thing, just broadly to point about this whole Tea Party saga, is that what they represent is they're the first like of the post 2008 populist movements in America. Like we say today that we're kind of like in an age of populism. Like you see both on the left and the right, you know, Democrats are now all trying to sound like Zoran Mamdani with with varying degrees of success. Sorry, I heard some people refer to this as sloppyism. Yeah, but it's interesting. It feels like you can't be just like an establishment candidate anymore. And if you want to know where that comes from, or where like kind of like the germ of the populist age emerges or first begins to like fertilize, it's after 2008, and the Tea Party is the first sort of proof of concept that you can have a populist movement that really catches on. Because I mean, you had like Perot in the 90s, but he runs in a presidential election twice, doesn't really get anyone elected to the state legislature. I mean, Jesse Ventura becomes governor of what, like Minnesota or something.
Yeah.
That's weird though. That doesn't go anywhere really. But the Tea Party are the first ones to show that you can be a populist movement and have staying power and really impact your own party. And that's a lesson that populists on both the left and the right are going to pick up from there, and it's going to really change American politics into what we view as recognizable today.
No, for sure. And I think that just to touch on to Tea Party's role in being the first modern populist movement in American history, it also shows the failure, at least of the popularity of the Reaganite, you know, Republican fusionist neoliberal consensus that had started in the 80s of, you know, broadly, we're going to shrink government a bit. We're going to, you know, promote free trade. We're going to, in the Republican Party, we have this, you know, alliance between social conservatives and fiscal conservatives. Even the Democrats have to moderate on economic issues towards the center under Bill Clinton. But the Tea Party's, you know, existence kind of negates the success of that, right? Because they exist because they think that consensus has failed, and they think that Obama is moving the country in like a left-wing direction away from the neoliberal paradigm, basically, right? So this kind of shows the Tea Party marks the end of that political consensus and towards a new age where the consensus is going to be broken and maybe perhaps no consensus is created. And I mean, to that point, I mean, between left and right and both wings, both political parties, there's clearly an escalation, partisanship, and polarization, escalating rhetoric, etc. That has really escalated during this period. Now, the Tea Party is not the beginning of the polarization and rising rhetoric in American politics. You can maybe go back to the 80s on that. But the Tea Party definitely had a role to play in escalating rhetoric with, and brinksmanship and partisanship for sure. I mean, maybe Jackson, you could speak on that a little more.
Yeah, it's in the escalation rhetoric. We've brought it up before, like how this really changes how a lot of conservatives see their own movement and the direction that the country is heading in. If you keep, and it makes sense, if you keep ratcheting up the temperature on your rhetoric, if you go from, well, it's not that the Democrats are just like mistaken or just like goody two shoes liberals, it's actually because they're literally evil. It's actually because they're child predators who are like eating children in the basements of DC pizza restaurants.
Good pizza place, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. Turns out there were children being eaten, but not in the basement of a restaurant. But yeah, but if you get to that point, at a certain point, your own beliefs have to catch up to that, and your own willingness to tolerate more extreme action on your side has to catch up to that. I mean, if you really believe that your enemies are as bad as you keep saying they are, eventually someone's going to ask, well, like, how are we still in the country with these people? You're saying that these people are like pawns of a new world order conspiracy to ruin the country, and that all we have to do to defeat them is what, like lower taxes? That's ridiculous. We need a fighter, someone who's not going to bow down to these people. We need somebody like Trump who's going to come in and sweep it all aside and do, the hard things that are unpleasant but necessary to restore the country. People might say, oh, how come like all this crazy MAGA stuff just emerges out of nowhere? But it didn't emerge out of nowhere. It's kind of a natural through line and really a logical through line of the constant escalation in rhetoric on the right that begins with the Tea Party. If you really do think things are as bad as they seem, then eventually you're going to get someone who promises he's going to do something about it.
Right. I mean, it's clear through line. The Tea Party escalated rhetoric. It's not entirely their fault, but they played a role, and they weren't able to offer a compelling ideology that could, match that rhetoric. But Trump eventually did, and then continued to escalate the rhetoric. And honestly, I think to some extent, that's why we're in the situation we're in now. And I think that got us things like Jan 6th and the incredibly toxic politics we have today. Definitely the Tea Party played a role in that. For if you think that for good or ill, I think they certainly did. And I think maybe then we can turn a little bit towards our earlier sort of discussion about the essence of conservatism dramatically changing, right? I mean, the Tea Party to Trump through line is still a little iffy, right? And clearly right, it is, because conservatism in America no longer really means the limited government sort of, free market, constitutionalist sort of governance of old. And the Tea Party was the last real incarnation of that sort of belief. And as they fall, a new sort of definition of conservatism arises in the MAGA movement, which is far more nationalistic, more based around principles like nativism and national conservatism. And I think this does mean a new era in American politics that we really haven't seen perhaps in decades, maybe even centuries. Maybe in a sense, the conservatives have rejected maybe some of the principles of the American Revolution, if we're really think about it that way.
Yeah, it's really crazy to think about if you really think about it historically and what a big change it is. And it also speaks interestingly to the question of how libertarianism is going to develop in the future. What is the future of libertarian conservatism? I guess the better question would be, honestly, is there a future for libertarian conservatism? Because as we mentioned before, with the whole escalation ladder when it comes to rhetoric, even if Trump, even when Trump dies, no one lives forever. It's going to be difficult to sort of peel back all the layers of escalation that he put onto the conservative movement,
Hmm.
especially considering everyone had sort of sworn allegiance to it. We said that even the attempt to kind of get rid of Trump and replace him with DeSantis had to be done through a magnified kind of version of the Tea Party. And so I don't really see a path forward for the Tea Party that involves them returning to libertarian prominence. And we are actually going to get a little more into this question in our next episode, which is going to actually be an interview with a libertarian conservative, where we're going to ask him some of these questions about the future of his movement.
Hmm.
But I don't know what you have in terms of your thoughts on this, Muhammad, but I personally don't really see a future for libertarian conservatism, at least not in the near term.
Yeah, I'm very pessimistic for them because I think MAGA has really redefined what it means to be conservative. They've redefined the whole worldview. They basically pitch to conservatives in America, the real problem is America's sovereignty and very existence under threats, and basically playing constitutionalist goody two shoes, low government involvement is just going to mean that the liberals will take the leverage of government power and use it against you, right? So that's why we need more of an interventionist, big government, honestly, sort of philosophy that can actually protect our national sovereignty, that can actually protect our cultural values, etc. And I just find it hard to believe that libertarian conservatives can really take that narrative back, basically, can defeat that narrative. Because I think if you are a conservative America, you will find that compelling.
I mean, if you want to look at I agree. If you want to look at where the future of a party is, I think you have to look at what do its young supporters believe. And if you talk to a lot of young Republicans, well, a lot of their minds are not fixed on deficit reduction. Let's just say that. They tend to lean more towards the more kind of radical elements of MAGA in a lot of ways. And if these are the people who are going to be in the RNC in the future, or even occupy like county Republican Party chair positions, you can really see this being a multi-generational institutionalization of MAGA, or at least of the kind of politics it creates.
Right.
And I just don't see really a way to break that if you're a libertarian. At the very least, you're going to have to play ball, and it kind of becomes a ship of Theseus thing after a while. If you keep replacing parts of the libertarian platform with MAGA, at what point do you stop being libertarian, just become MAGA with a few libertarian eccentricities thrown in here and there?
Right. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. But with that, well, I think it's a wrap. I
Mm-hmm.
think I want to thank everybody who's made it through 90 minutes of learning about the Tea Party and libertarian conservatism and early 2010s politics.
Yes, you're all very, very brave.
Must commend you all.
Certainly.
No, but I want to just give a quick reminder to you all that we're going to have a libertarian conservative populist guest episode coming out in about a week, and that next month we'll be coming out with our national conservative content episode. We will
Mm-hmm.
be releasing content episodes monthly, and then sometimes we'll have guest episodes or special episodes attached to those content episodes. So if you want to keep updated about our episode releases, then you got to make sure to follow our Instagram page for updates on episode date drops. You can just search A Winter of Discontent or Winter of Discontent on Instagram to find our page. Our Instagram handle is also going to be in the description of this video, as are all our sources and evidence for our various claim statistics, if you really do doubt us, sincere fellows. Well, thank you all again for listening. This is Mohammed Kazarunian signing off on A Winter of Discontent.
Yep, this is Jackson Meiser signing off. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you next time.